Hi, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's been a lovely day being here. To introduce myself, I'm from Imperial College, where I write about the influence of Frederick Taylor and other types of engineers on how we organise, measure and manage work, even to the present day. And to start with an anecdote, I attended the Frederick Taylor Archive in New Jersey a couple of years ago to do my research, and the archivist staff are very interested to meet me, because it's very unusual for a British person to go that far. Now so much is known about Frederick Winslow Taylor, why would I need to go all that way when I can just pick up the books? And I entered the archive, the archivist came out and was very surprised, and she said, "We all thought you'd be much, much older." And it's probably something you're thinking right now. I'm old enough, trust me. So I kind of interpreted this summary session by changing the title a little, which you can see on the PowerPoint. And I've divided it amongst themes that we can all discuss, rather than going through every individual paper point by point. So I think intrinsic in the title of this session today is something which I've called there changing the question. As we've heard several times, the First World War is usually characterized as a chemist's war, sometimes as an engineers and chemists or some combination, and we normally think of physics in the Second World War. So what I took from this event is what happens to what British history looks like, British and other histories look like, when we change the question. Who stays in the picture but looks different? Who different we don't know about comes into the picture? What organizations are we now looking at? And what kind of themes become important or stay important in our history books? And I think it's important, as I'll hope to demonstrate in just two quick examples from the First World War, which touch upon themes addressed today, about what I call here hidden and alternative histories, which relates to David's talk on myths and other types of interpretations of history, which we don't tend to hear about so much. Now, why does this matter? This matters because World War I has been re-remembered, re-studied, re-researched in 100 years since it took place. And certain interpretations of the history of World War I and who we look at and what they were doing in it have almost built up like a sediment in a harbour. I personally think, in relation to stuff I write about to do with organisation and mobilisation and that kind of thing, and who experts, technocrats, and so on, to me a particular interpretation of World War I was accumulated just at the start of World War II, when similar issues were being established, such as what was the history of the Ministry of Munitions, and can we replicate it in World War II? And I think this gave rise, to some extent, to the Ministry of Supply and of the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Now, to give you two anecdotes in which the interpretation of the First World War relates to some very famous people matters a lot, where I've changed the question, just 2 minutes on each of them. There is and this relates to the themes of many of the questions of today, there is in the historiography of the US Navy a particular interpretation of the start of World War I, right? Particularly the US Navy shipyards where they used to make and maintain the ships. The studies that exist go like this. Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was an incredibly famous American engineer, which he was in the public eye at the time, tried to help the US Navy shipyards to become more efficient, because that would be good for the war effort if one came about. However, due to the creaking bureaucracy and vested interests of the federal government, he was not listened to, and this genius expert engineer was in fact ignored. Okay, I've been in the papers and I confirm that is the case. However, I changed the question there and said, okay, who wasn't ignored? Who did they get in and pay a lot of money to reorganize the production and to manage the US Navy shipyards? And the answer is the British armaments producer Vickers, right? And we don't tend to hear in the history books about the iron hand of British management being implemented in the US Navy shipyards in order to make it more efficient. But I simply changed the question, and the answer became then very interesting, I think, to all of us. Again, and this is all sort of alternative interpretations of very famous people, again, in whose history the First World War is important in relation to science, technology, and wider issues. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly about a chemist, a late Victorian chemist who's trained in chemistry, practiced in chemistry in the private sector in the late 19th century, while also, as a hobby, used to do little surveys and things like that, using his love of statistical modelling. During World War I, became a key advisor to David Lloyd George, and indeed an important manager and innovator at the enormous Ministry of Munitions, running its Health of the Munition Workers Committee. during the interwar period, was a key British and indeed European business intellectual, listened to probably more than most other Europeans in the US business community, and would travel the world and was seen to be a very successful. People would travel from all over the world to see the plant where manufacturing took place. During World War II, was the president of the National Institute of Industrial Psychology, entering advanced age by this point, but still became incredibly influential in the post-war Attlee government in how it improves and measures labour productivity, right? And indeed, that was still in the Labour Party manifesto of 2015. Who am I talking about? I'm talking about Seaborn Rowntree, the cake-making guy who made chocolates and things like that up in York. But we don't think of him like this because he fits a very good narrative of the welfare state, and I don't disagree with that, and I think that's important. But there's a symmetry to this, which I think has been missed out in the history books, and where I come in to try and look at this. So, addressing these issues throughout today's papers, I've come up with 5 themes which I thought were very excellently explored. The first is a standard one of the histories of World War I, which is continuity and change. Did the war bring about some radical change, or had it been generated over a longer period of time? What was that change? Was it necessary? When did it take place during the war? As we've heard from many of the questions, and I completely agree that in the stuff I write about, there was a massive mobilization midway through World War I when it was realized the war was not going to be over soon. But at the time, there were, of course, calls for, oh, so-and-sos should have been listened to earlier and this kind of thing. But I think personally that it's fair. But this fits into, as David and Adrian got on to, much longer narratives of British decline or relative decline, relations with the empire, the role of experts in government and the state, and so on. The second issue which I thought would be is raised, even though the war was relatively short, is that of chronology. As I just suggested, there was in many of the papers today an implied break in 1915 and 16. It was interesting to hear that there's a similar story there in the history of Germany as well. And I imagine, in fact no, in the case of most other belligerent countries, there does seem to have been this large shift. And it's very interesting to see who suddenly got listened to at that mid-war or intensified war period. Something else we could look at that, and this is something that was less of a focus, because I think always starting things is sometimes more interesting than why we stop things. Many of the papers looked into carrying on our analysis into the interwar period, so where these people went, what they studied, did they become wealthy and successful, did they win prizes and patents and so on. But of course the war, as most specialists of World War I realise, the war in terms of institutions did not really stop in 1918. It went on even as a belligerent conflict until 1919. And then some institutions, such as I have worked on the Ministry of Munitions, was axed in 1921. So the war, to me, is 1916 to 1921, and when I write about it, that's kind of what I write about. But I know that's also something very interesting to analyse. Something the next theme, number 3, the one I was very excited to see came up explicitly, was the relations between the public sector and the private sector, particularly over what is not perhaps the sexiest of topics by name, but I think by colossal importance, which is the history of procurement. Yeah, and if you don't think procurement matters, look at the Olympic Games debacle with G4S a few years ago, and look at what the discussion over the NHS now and its privatisation, which is, in my opinion, more to do with procurement of personnel and services and equipment. Now this, of course, obviously became a huge issue during World War I, not just munitions, not just, as we heard from Adrian, aeroplanes, also all the scientific equipment that Liz and Don were talking about. This stuff had to be got from somewhere or manufactured. And as Adrian pointed out, sometimes there were not supplies, so intended procurement processes could not be conducted. And then innovators had to innovate with what they had. And this gets back to the book that was mentioned right at the start, which is David Edison's Shock of the Old, which I think plays on this, is what happens when the kind of most modern option isn't an option, and you have to innovate with what you've got. There were, of course, and we tend to not think about it like this, but there was a massive procurement of human resources. We call it conscription, usually. But, you know, we're talking about a very active state, which I'll come back to in a minute. And other things procured all kinds of civilian personnel as well, usually by conscription, but also by other methods such as payment by results and all this kind of issue. Which gets me also to touch on something which I'm delighted came up all the time, which is the topic of money, where it came from, where it went, who is profiting out of all of this, who isn't profiting out of all of this. And I'd just like to quickly cite Sheila Mariner's excellent study, which you should all read, of the Ministry of Munitions, that basically the state was printing money in order to get the ministry productive and to incentivize workers, but the costing controls were not in place for them to then work out where the money went after the war ended. So basically hemorrhaged millions and millions of pounds, or may have done, but they couldn't work it out. So in some senses, the bureaucracy didn't work in this case, and that was something that was remembered in World War II in trying to set up these large ministries. Does that mean? Okay, point number 4, something I thought was excellent, and it goes to this changing the question. Who were these physicists? What were they doing? What were they good at? What did people see them to be good at? Did they get, were they kept on in some superior capacity? We heard, and I don't know, no expert in this, there were no physicists in the government. There certainly were physicists and other types of scientists, engineers, accountants, and administrators in the state, definitely, and I mentioned C. Van Roundtree already. And the question, were they trained, or were they already trained, and so on. We learned from Don's paper and Adrian's analysis about the importance of who are these people? Are they professionals? Are they amateurs? Are they both? Are they amateur inventors but professionals at business, as Adrian looks at? Are they academics? Which there was a tendency to downplay academics, which is great, I think, because sometimes they've been maybe a bit too focused upon. And number 5 is the final point before we get on to the hopefully exciting Q&A. Something that I think that came up repeatedly throughout, but not quite explicitly, was the changing nature, or not, it could be continuity, as I mentioned, of the state. Not just of the British state, because of course we're really talking about all of World War I here, but most of the papers focused on Britain, as I do. We saw the creation of huge and wealthy organisations, such as the BIR and the DSIR, but of course the continuity issue is there, because sometimes these fed on pre-war tendencies and organisations and people. So, to address the title which I've given myself here, point number 6, as it were. I think when we change the question and do it explicitly and with a purpose, I think it's possible to shake out all kinds of new and interesting historical studies, which a person addressed earlier in one of the questions, is what new does this bring? To explicitly attempt to do so, I think, is firstly the best thing the way to look at this, because then one knows when one has succeeded. If there's something new coming out of this, new people, new places, new things, that give us a more complete picture of Britain and everywhere else during World War I. And I'm very happy that physics and physicists in the Great War helped to contribute to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Would anybody like to start with questions? Yeah.
In all of the important things you've raised for us today, an issue that has been rising by implications for me, listening to the whole papers, which have been very challenging, has been the question of science and ethics.
Mm-hmm. Do you mean physics and ethics, or all science?
Physics and ethics is fine.
Well, there are more. All the speakers are more expert than that on me. So if I can field it to any of them.
Yeah, David wants to come in.
Go on.
I mean, one angle that occurs to me on that is, in the Second World War, you had physicists who refused to work on war projects. I don't know if that was a phenomenon in the First World War.
I'd be interested to hear what your list of physicists who refused to work on war projects
Well, for example, Ravi refused the invitation to go to Los Alamos. There were a number of examples of physicists who were asked to do a particular kind of research, I said no.
Sure, but he was working on radar, I think, wasn't he?
Sure, no, I don't know. But I mean, you certainly mean that there were people who were asked to conduct particular kinds of research and didn't do so on ethical grounds.
I once asked Margaret Gowing if anyone had ever refused to work on the British atomic bomb project, and she looked at me, clearly thinking hard, and she said, absolutely not. The issue has never even arisen in all the papers that I've ever read. Now that might be the simply don't ask.
That's true.
That's what she said.
Joseph Oplat, for example, refused to work on.
That's not quite right. That's a story that Roplat told, for sure. But I think that
Roplat was the only person also who left Los Angeles.
That's what he says. Yes, that's what he said. The reasons why he left aren't entirely clear, and he actually continued to be associated with the bomb project. So I know what the mythology is on this story, and I suppose that's why I wanted to intervene on this question, because certainly after the Second World War, the standard way of talking about the relations between science and war was to invoke an ethical question. So the first big book on the atomic bomb, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, the moral and political history of the atomic scientists, Tongues of Conscience, another book that was written at the time. Oppenheimer is turned into this kind of moral hero. In the British case, C.P. Snow tries to turn Henry Tizard into a kind of British equivalent, as he stands up to this bastard semi-German militarist Lindemann. And going back to the First World War, you have stuff about Fritz Haber's wife committing suicide because he was working on chemical weapons and all this kind of stuff. So that story is a big story in terms of the writing about science or war. And of course, there's a famous case, the Italian case of Majorama. This is the greatest Sicilian since Archimedes, who disappeared on a journey between Sicily and Rome in, I think, 1938, and it's led to all sorts of speculation that he either became a monk or committed suicide because he foresaw the uses to which his atomic physics would be put. There is absolutely no evidence for any of this. But it's exactly the kind of story that would be told about an atomic physicist after the Second World War. So I think that the basic story is that most physicists, chemists, biologists, doctors did their duty as they understood it, and that meant serving their country, and that it certainly included making of weapons, and so changing the question. There is a tiny minority of people who were conscientious objectors. In the First World War, some of them, indeed scientists, a very, very small number. In the Second World War, no convincing case comes to mind, though the story is told as if scientists are standing for morality against others. So I think that's definitely not a question to ask about the relations of science and war. It's a question that's been asked and answered too many times in deeply misleading ways. And C.P. Snow and Jacob Bronowski are good examples of that. If I give you a second to talk about Jacob Bronowski on this, I'll take it.
Sorry, David?
I could say something about Jacob Bronowski, mythologizing on this. In the Ascent of Man, there's a famous BBC series that came out in 1973. He has a whole section on the atomic bomb, and he tells the story of the atomic bomb not through, say, General Groves or Robert Oppenheimer or anyone that's actually seriously involved in the making of the bomb, but through the story of Leo Tizard. And he tells one story. Szilard, yes. Sorry, I mispronounced. Leo Szilard, yes. And it has him crossing the road in London. He gets the idea of the chain reaction, and he says that because he wants to keep the atomic secret, he hands it over to the British Admiralty, i.e. the British Navy. Complete absurdity. And it continues the story. It ends up with Szilard arguing against the use of the atomic bomb in 1945, which he sort of did, along with a minority of scientists involved in the project, and doesn't tell us that immediately after the war, Szilard, like Bertrand Russell, was keen to launch preventative, as they were called, atomic strikes against the Soviet Union. So not only is it focused on the wrong person, exactly the wrong kind of story is told. There are lots of very obvious stories to tell about the bomb. It seems to me, which should be at the centre of our account of physics in the Second World War as well as the Great War. Thank you.
Good. I've got two people to come to, but before I do, Michael, I think there was a loose end that you left tantalisingly not tied up. You mentioned the issue of the state, which I thought was a really interesting one, that the First World War, in procurement and mobilisation and getting the scientists to work and so on, the state became much bigger than it had done. And you said you would say more about that. I don't think you did, so
right.
I'm inviting you to say more about it now.
I mean, people do write about the Ministry of Munitions. As far I could be wrong. It's very hard to get a sense, especially from the official histories, of the sort of shape of the wartime state in its kind of balanced way. Does anyone know if there's a sort of chart or something? And we desperately need one for World War II because it's even much harder. Anybody know? No. Of when the different organs of the state came into being and so on. It became bigger and much more powerful. It didn't do what was happening in places like Russia, which was forced requisitioning as opposed to procurement.
But it is a striking fact, and it's something I've never pondered before, that one consequence of the war, and perhaps one of the most lasting consequences, is an involvement by the state in areas of life where it previously hadn't been.
Yeah, and it takes on moral and legal, new moral and legal conceptions as a consequence of this. It was okay to do it, is the lesson. And in emergencies, this is kind of what you have, in a big war, this is what you do.
Yeah.
But also I'm keen, the reason why I was going to come back to it is I'm keen to stress some continuity here, because there are, we're talking about the British Empire here. I mean, there were massive organisations, the Indian Army, the Navy, and things like that, but it's just, the East India Company, as I think David mentioned earlier, we go back hundreds of years with this. But so what I was kind of thinking about when I was saying that is what am I arguing that's new about the nature of the British state in the World War, and what am I not arguing? And I'm thinking about it out loud now. And that's fine.
Adrian, is this on this question?
Just that, just simply, one of the things that I think is interesting is the fact that by the time you get into 1917, that the state itself is conscious of that and projects it. So that if you look at late recruitment films, then, or if they're explaining the Derby scheme, then they project onto the screen a manifestation of a heavily bureaucratic state. And they're not afraid to say that we have expanded in this way, and showing the way in which the expansion of the state is driven by the fact that you're in a mechanical, sort of analog age, so that in fact you have new machinery which you can utilise in terms of mobilising the nation. But at the end of the day, that machinery will only work if you've got the people to operate it. And so therefore, you see these fantastic shots of these amazing filing systems, and the people who are using them, and somewhere in there, in that filing system, is Joe Bloggs or whatever it is, who's going to be the car's going to be pulled out and he's going to be duly summoned for his medical, etc., etc., etc.
But another aspect of this is that it involves responsibilities as well as rights. It's not just that the state has the right to do things it hadn't before, but also the state has responsibility.
Yeah, so then in those same films, then you would see, for example, when you're talking about Canary Girls, you're talking about women coming into the factories, ordnance factories, then they go to great pains to show the way in which there will be appropriate medical supervision, and we recognise that you are working for us now, but that, as you say, but we have an obligation in terms of respecting your
right, and so if the state can send millions of people to war, when they come back wounded, the state has a responsibility to look after them.
Yes, and that's the regular.
Right, let's move on to another.
Well, on the issue of scientists who did choose not to fight, the classic example is Lewis Richardson, who invented weather forecasting as we understand it, served with the Friends Ambulance Corps, wrote the first ever textbook on weather forecasting, the foundation of computational fluid dynamics, lost it, wrote it again, ended up in the initial Met Office after the war, resigned when it was taken over by the MOD and the Air Ministry, never held a steady job again until eventually he became a fellow at Cambridge towards the end of his life. But the academic work that came out of his war was the numerical study of arms races.
Of what?
Arms races.
Oh,
He studied war as a system of differential equations.
okay.
Giles Fodden's novel, Turbulence, is loosely based on him and roughly gets him right, except for some biographical details. You do have these people who seem to have just drifted through, and they managed to have avoided authority on one side and just kept on doing the science they wanted, somehow.
That's interesting. I think you were next.
Thank you. I apologise for arriving so late. I've been stuck on the M4 for quite a long time. And I don't know if you've talked at all about Russia, which is my interest, a little bit, I hear, about the Soviet Union. And I suppose one obvious point is that, of course, the civil war in Russia continued the war much longer, and many moral issues on both sides. And not a huge amount is written about it, as far as I know, though I need to do more research on this, but mostly we know about it from novels, and Solzhenitsyn being the obvious example, and quite a lot of contemporary writers are returning to that now. And also, I think somebody said the British scientists did their duty. Well, yes, but sometimes alongside spies. And the moral issues, of course, are far greater in Germany and Russia than they were in Britain, I think.
Yes, no, absolutely. What time do we want to wrap this up? 5. But about 4 people have their hands up. So. Sorry? Let's do it. We have to be, okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to wrap it up. But the fact that we've got such a queue of people wanting to get in, I think, shows how stimulating this day has been. So I'd like to end by thanking all our speakers. The quality of papers, I think, has been extraordinarily high. I've really enjoyed the conference. And I'd like to thank Joe and James and the committee of the Centre for putting together a really wonderful conference. Thank you very much.